Can you imagine, just imagine spending 18 years of your life in prison
Oh, wow.
for a crime you didn't commit.
Yeah.
That's the reality for Richard Rosario. He's serving a 25 to life sentence
Oh,
for a murder that happened back in 1996 in the Bronx.
okay.
But Rosario claims he wasn't even in New York when it happened.
Mm.
He says he was in Florida, and he even gave the police a list of 13 people who could back up his story.
So is he a desperate man clinging to a lie, or did the justice system actually make a mistake?
That's exactly what we're going to try to figure out in this deep dive.
Okay.
We've got police reports, court documents, and even accounts from a reporter who's been investigating Rosario's story. We're going to look at all the evidence and see if we can get closer to the truth.
That's amazing. So what do we have to work with?
Well, we have some pretty fascinating stuff. We've got eyewitness testimonies, the fact that there are no alibi witness interviews in the police reports, and the reporter's own journey to uncover the truth.
Wow, this is going to be good.
It is. So let's go back to that day in 1996, June 19th, just before 10 p.m., in a parking lot in the South Bronx. The victim, 17-year-old George Collazo, was walking with his friend Michael Sanchez when they had a run-in with two other men.
Right. It's like a pretty ordinary encounter.
It does, but it turned tragic. According to the police reports, there was a brief argument, maybe some pushing and shoving, and then the two groups went their separate ways.
So what happened?
Well, one of the men from the other group came back. He followed Collazo and Sanchez and shot Collazo in the face.
Oh my gosh.
And then he took off in a car that was waiting nearby.
That's awful. And this was in New York City in the 90s. A lot of pressure on the police to solve these cases.
Absolutely. And there wasn't much physical evidence at the scene.
I see.
So they had to rely on the eyewitnesses, Sanchez, who saw the murder happen, and Robert Davis, a porter who was working nearby. Both of them picked Rosario out of a mugshot book.
Ah, mugshot books. For those who don't know, those are like big books filled with photos of people who've been arrested before.
Right. And that's how the police got to Richard Rosario. But here's where Rosario's story changes things up. He claims that he was in Florida at the time of the murder and that he called the police himself when he found out he was a suspect.
Really? That's a bold move for someone who's supposedly guilty.
Yeah, Rosario told the reporter he gave the police names of 13 people, family and friends, who could confirm he was in Florida when the murder happened.
13 people.
13 people. But here's the catch. When the reporter looked at the police reports, there's no mention of any of these alibi witnesses being interviewed. Not a single one.
Wow. That's strange.
It is. To understand this, we need to consider what it was like for detectives back then. We talked to Bobby Delato, a retired homicide detective who worked tons of cases in the Bronx during that time. He wasn't on Rosario's case, but he knows what it was like.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Delato told us that resources were really limited back then. The detectives were dealing with a lot of violent crime, and there was huge pressure to close cases quickly.
I can imagine.
And think about it, if you have two eyewitnesses who seem to be pointing to the same guy, would you really go and track down a dozen alibi witnesses in another state?
Especially when you think you already have the guy.
Right. But what if even one of those 13 people could back up Rosario's alibi?
Right. That makes you wonder, did the detectives really do their job, or did they just ignore Rosario's claims?
Yeah, that's a big question. And we can't forget about Rosario's family. He was only 20 when this happened.
Oh, wow.
He had a wife, a young daughter, and a baby on the way.
Oh, gosh. Imagine being those kids, growing up without a father and knowing he's in prison, maybe for something he didn't even do.
It's heartbreaking. It makes you think about all the things Rosario has missed, birthdays, holidays, graduations, years of his life just gone.
So is he a victim or is he a master manipulator? Are we going to find out what happened?
Well, the reporter actually went to Florida to track down those alibi witnesses himself.
Really? To try and find those people after all these years?
Yep, it's a long shot.
Yep.
But maybe they hold the key to figuring out this mystery.
I can't wait to hear what he finds out. Welcome back. Before we get to the Florida trip, there's something we haven't talked about yet.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
If Rosario was in Florida when the murder happened, how did his picture even end up in a Bronx mugshot book?
That's a good point. I was wondering about that.
Well, it turns out a few years before the murder, Rosario was arrested for robbery in the Bronx.
Ah, so even if he was living in Florida, he still had a connection to the area.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It explains why his face was in that mugshot book.
Okay, so that makes sense. So let's talk about the reporter's trip to Florida. He's trying to find those 13 alibi witnesses, people who could completely change the case against Rosario. But finding people from 20 years ago, that seems impossible.
It does. It's hard enough to keep track of people. Now imagine trying to find them after 2 decades. People change their names, their phone numbers.
So did he find anyone?
He did. He actually managed to locate some of the people on Rosario's list.
Really?
What did they say?
One woman who knew Rosario well said he was definitely in Orlando during the time of the murder.
Wow.
She even remembers a specific day they went to a theme park together.
A theme park. That's a pretty strong memory to have after all these years. It is. And she wasn't the only one. The reporter found another witness who placed Rosario at a family gathering in Orlando around the same time.
So it's not just one person saying he was there. Multiple people are backing up his alibi.
Right? Which means those eyewitness identifications in the Bronx could be wrong. We've all heard about how unreliable eyewitness testimony can be.
Absolutely. Especially in stressful situations like witnessing a crime.
And now we have several people saying Rosario was in another state altogether. It definitely raises some doubts.
It sounds like Rosario might actually be telling the truth.
But you sound unsure.
I don't know. It just seems too easy. I have a feeling there's something more to this story. Something we're missing.
You might be right. As the reporter dug deeper into Rosario's life in Florida, he found something interesting. A pattern of behavior that raises some questions.
Okay, I'm listening. What kind of pattern?
It seems Rosario had a habit of getting into minor trouble with the law in Florida. Nothing serious, but there were a few times he avoided getting in trouble by not being completely truthful about who he was.
He was using aliases, trying to get out of trouble.
That's what it looks like. The reporter found cases where Rosario gave different names, even different birthdays, to the police in Florida.
So he wasn't always honest. This makes things a lot more complicated.
It does. On one hand, we have these alibi witnesses who seem to support Rosario, but on the other hand, he has this history of lying and deception.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if he could have made up this whole alibi story.
Right. Is he a master manipulator, or is he innocent, and these past mistakes are just that mistakes?
It's hard to know. If he was really in Florida, why would he lie about his identity there? Doesn't make sense.
That's the big question, and it's the question the reporter was trying to answer as he continued his investigation.
So what happened next? Did he find anything else that could tell us where Rosario was and what he was doing?
Well, there's one more thing. The reporter found out about a woman who was living in the Bronx when the murder happened.
A secret girlfriend.
Oh.
Maybe she's the key to all of this.
Well, we don't know her name, but we know she had a child with Rosario while he was living in Florida. And it seems like he was sending her money to help support them.
So even though they were living in different states, they were still connected financially. This just keeps getting more complicated.
It does, and it raises new questions. The reporter found out that Rosario had been working different jobs in Florida, but it's not clear if he was making enough money to send regular support payments.
So maybe the reason for the murder wasn't revenge or a love triangle. Maybe it was about money. Could Rosario have been desperate for money and somehow involved in something that led to the victim's death?
It's possible. We're still putting the pieces together, but this new information definitely changes things.
It makes you wonder if Rosario's hiding something. Like maybe he needed money more than he's letting on.
That's a good point. And as the reporter kept digging, he found some inconsistencies in Rosario's stories about his money. Remember how Rosario used different names and birthdays in the past?
Yeah.
Well, it seems like he wasn't always honest about his money either.
So his story isn't as perfect as it seemed. The more we learn, the more it looks like Rosario might not be so innocent after all.
You're right. And the reporter started to think that maybe Rosario's trip to Florida wasn't as simple as he said it was.
You mean it wasn't just a visit to see family?
Right. The reporter looked into what Rosario was doing in Florida, and it seems like he might have been involved in some things that weren't exactly legal.
Okay, now this is getting interesting. What kind of things? Was he dealing drugs? Gambling? Something like that?
You don't know the details, but it's clear that Rosario was hanging around people who weren't following the law. This makes you think about those alibi witnesses again. Were they really telling the truth? Or were they protecting Rosario and his secrets?
So we're back to square one.
Yeah.
We had these alibi witnesses, but Rosario's actions tell a different story.
Exactly. It's hard to know what to believe. Is Rosario really good at lying and tricking people? Or is he actually innocent and his past doesn't matter?
So last time we were talking about this woman in the Bronx. What about her?
Well, her name's never revealed, but we know she had a kid with Rosario while he was in Florida, and it seems like he was sending money to help support them.
So even though they lived in different states, there was still that connection, huh? The money thing.
It does. And it brings up even more questions. The reporter found out that Rosario had been working different jobs down in Florida, but it's not clear if he was making enough to send regular support payments.
So maybe the murder wasn't about revenge or some love triangle. Maybe it was all about the money. Could Rosario have been so desperate that he got involved in something that led to the victim's death?
It's definitely a possibility. Remember, we're still piecing this whole thing together, but this adds a whole new layer to the case.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder if there's more to the story than Rosario's letting on. Like maybe he needed money even more than he's saying.
That's a good point. And as the reporter dug deeper, he found some things that didn't quite add up in Rosario's stories about his finances. Remember how Rosario used different names and birthdays before?
Right.
Well, it seems like he wasn't always honest about his money either.
So his story's not as clear-cut as it seemed. The more we find out, the more it looks like Rosario might not be so innocent.
That's true. And the reporter started wondering if Rosario's trip to Florida was as simple as he made it sound.
You mean it wasn't just a visit to see family and friends?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The reporter did some more digging into what Rosario was up to in Florida, and it looks like he might have been involved in some shady stuff.
Like what? Give me the details. Drugs? Gambling? Illegal stuff?
We don't know exactly what it was, but it's clear that Rosario was hanging out with some people who weren't exactly following the law. And this makes you think about those alibi witnesses again. Were they really telling the truth, or were they just covering for Rosario, protecting him and whatever he was up to?
So we're back to square one, huh? We have these alibi witnesses, but Rosario's actions tell a whole different story.
It's true. It really is hard to know what to believe. Is Rosario a really good liar who's managed to fool everyone? Or is he actually innocent and his past doesn't mean anything? It's tough to say. And after all this investigation, even the reporter doesn't have a definite answer. It's frustrating, but it really makes you think.
That's how it is with these real-life mysteries. Sometimes you don't get a nice, neat ending. But this deep dive wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about looking at how our justice system works and how hard it can be to find out the truth. We've seen how eyewitnesses can be wrong, how pressure can affect police investigations, and how even alibis can fall apart when you look closely.
You're right, this case has been wild, full of twists and turns. Richard Rosario's story really shows how hard it is to find the truth and how justice isn't always fair. It makes you question everything about memory motive and our legal system.
Absolutely. And don't forget the human cost. It's not just about the person who's been convicted, but their families too. For me, it's the questions that are left unanswered. What was Rosario really doing in Florida? Who's this woman who had his child? What does she know? And the biggest question of all, is Richard Rosario a criminal who got away with murder? Or is he a victim who's been wrongly imprisoned? I don't know if we'll ever know for sure, but this is a case I won't forget.
That's what's so powerful about these stories. They make you face the hard truths and the fact that people aren't always what they seem. They remind us that things aren't always black and white and that there's always more to uncover.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Richard Rosario's case. We hope it gave you something to think about. Let us know what you think. Did Rosario do it? Share your thoughts with us on social media and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into another true crime story.